All right, so since we have discussed how the DNS protocol works, let's have some discussion on what kind of attacks can be launched by the attackers on this protocol. First of all, DNS footprinting attack can be launched in order to find out the name servers, in order to find out the mail exchange servers, in order to find out the canonical names, IP addresses, and so on. So by using the tool like NSLookup, which I already demonstrated, the DNS records can be easily found. We can also use the dig utility to find this information. So you can see here, you have the information about the Google name servers, NS1, NS2, NS4, and then here at the bottom, you can see the IP addresses of these name servers of Google. Now, the attackers, they usually perform reconnaissance or footprinting in order to find the IP addresses, and then they can prepare their attack vectors against these servers or these hosts. You can also use the tool called DNS Recon, which again, it's a very easy to use tool, which can find out the DNS records and information. It also shows you here that DNS security is not configured for Cisco.com. Now, like I said, that in order to secure DNS, we have to implement DNS sec, but DNS sec implementation is not that easy, and most of the organizations they avoid using DNS sec. So you can imagine if an organization like Cisco is not using, so what to talk about the other organization. So you can see here the IP addresses of all the name servers. You can also see the information about the mail exchange servers. You can see the mm, other information. For instance, here you can see that the bind version is not available. I'll talk about bind version shortly. Now, mm, there is a tool called dig that can be used to send a version.bind query, which basically will grab the banner of the DNS and will tell you what kind of operating system is running. So here you can see that we are using dig version.bind query, and the script that we are using is um, dns1.ngit.edu. Sorry, the domain that we are targeting is dns1.ngit.edu. Now, what you see here is that after running this tool, we actually find that Red Hat 9.11.4 is being used, which is hosting this DNS server. Now, finding out the operating system is one of the most significant step if you are, if the attacker or the hacker, he's trying to launch attacks on this server, because not every operating system is vulnerable. So you need to find out what kind of operating system is actually running, what version of that operating system is running. Right, so this is again a kind of a reconnaissance attack. You can also find the subdomains of a main domain. Like, for example, sublister tool can be used to find the subdomain. So here you can see sublister, sublister with 3 instead of E is there. With -D, it will tell you what are the subdomains of njit.edu. So you can find out www.njit.edu, canvas, catalog.njit, civil.njit, connect.njit, and so on. So remember that the attackers, they want to gather as much information about the target as they can, because sometimes the main domain is not exploitable or hackable, but the subdomains usually they might be less protected as compared to the main domain. So you can use several tools like Sublister, Fierce, Recon-ng. Recon-ng is an amazing tool that can be used to find even more information about the domains. So this is the example of a Fierce tool, which again does the same job, tries to find out the subdomains, their IP addresses, and so on. Now, apart from the recon attack or the information gathering attack, DNS is also vulnerable to phishing and pharming attacks. And we know that the DNS, is actually used to resolve the domain name into the IP addresses. And this information is critical because if the DNS query that you're sending to resolve the domain name into a certain IP, if it's not correctly resolved and it is resolved to some other IP address, it means that your request will be redirected to the other IP address that has been resolved by the DNS server. And so we basically assume that the DNS requests that we are sending, they are resolved correctly. And I mean, this is the default understanding about the DNS protocol. However, you can think of a scenario where an attacker can control these DNS requests that are being resolved by the DNS server. So what will happen in that case? So the attack, which is called the pharming attack, in this attack, the attacker, he can cause the requests of the websites to resolve to a false or the fake IP address, and that IP address will belong to the attacker's own fake web server. And by using, phishing as a tool, the attacker can make the website look exactly similar to the original website. And then once the user, they try to log in with their username and passwords, that information can be stolen, the credit card, and the personal information of the users can also be stolen. So the attacker usually combines the pharming and phishing attacks in order to steal this kind of information. So let's have a look at this example, for instance. Here you can see that the original website is this one, and the original query usually works like this, that if the target or the victim is trying to visit www.example.com, the normal operation is that the DNS server will resolve it to the actual IP address, which is 208.77.188.166. Whereas if the attacker somehow manages to resolve this to a fake IP address, means forces the DNS server to resolve it to 74.208.31.6, then the user will be redirected to this IP address, which will be hosting a fake website which looks exactly the same like the original one. So from a user's perspective, the website doesn't have anything fishy, so he's going to probably log in with the username and password, and he won't even know that it's basically a fake website, and his credentials will be stolen. Now, the damage of the pharming attacks, they are very significant because uh, there's a lot of trust that is placed in how the DNS actually works. For instance, the emails, they also relies on the DNS records, right? Because the DNS provides the IP addresses of the mail exchange server. So what if the attacker manages to change these MX or mail exchange server records, and then the attacker's emails, they are redirected to the, instead of going to the actual mail servers, the mail or the emails, they will be forwarded to the fake mail server. Or in other words, the attacker will be able to read and compromise the information that is in those emails. And usually nowadays we see that the username and passwords, they are usually recovered by emails. So if the emails have been redirected to attacker, he can obviously change the passwords or use the recovery method. And when the email is sent to the attacker, he will be able to reset the passwords. Also, another impact of these kind of attacks can have really serious consequences. For instance, the operating system updates are usually done automatically through the servers of these organizations like Microsoft, for instance, or other Ubuntu-based operating systems. So if the associated domain name for these OS updates, if it has been replaced by the malicious IP addresses by the attacker, it means that the attacker's system will be redirected for updates to fake server, and which on that server, the attacker will place malicious executables, which will basically compromise the system of the user. So here you can see that by using the DNS poisoning kind of attacks, the attacker can gain access to the emails, gain access to the systems, and the effects of this attack are really really devastating. for the targets. Let's talk about the DNS cache poisoning attack. How does this basically work? So the basic idea behind this attack is that the attacker will try to trick the DNS server into caching the false DNS records. And as a result, the client, because he relies on the DNS server to provide him the records. So if the DNS server is compromised by using DNS cache poisoning, then he will get the false IP addresses and he will be redirected to the attacker's website. So let's take an example of how the DNS cache poisoning works. So here the attacker Eve, he executes a DNS cache poisoning attack against his own DNS server. So what the Eve is doing is that he is trying to launch the cache poisoning attack against his own ISP DNS server. Now, how does it work? In step number 1, Eve will send a DNS query to the ISP DNS server, which in turn will query an authoritative name server on behalf of Eve. So let's just assume that Eve is trying to compromise Google.com, for instance. So what is he going to do? He's going to send a request that, okay, I want to access www.google.com. I want the IP address, and this request is forwarded to his ISP DNS server. Now, let's imagine or assume that the ISP DNS server, it does not have the IP address. So what is he going to do? According to the DNS protocol that we learned, he is going to forward this query to the authoritative name server of google.com. So when this request goes to authoritative name server, what Eve will do is that immediately he will flood the ISP's DNS server with a forged DNS response to her own query. So first he sent the query, and then he will flood the DNS server with the fake response that, okay, I'm the authoritative name server, and here is the IP address of www.google.com. Now, the way he does is that he will manage to spoof the IP address of the authoritative name server. The destination IP address is the ISP DNS server of the ISP of Eve, and the response will contain a fake IP address as an answer to the query that he made by himself. So in that case, what will happen? The ISP DNS server will accept the forged queries by Eve, and he will cache this result, which will contain the malicious IP address. Now you might be thinking that, okay, what happened with the query that was sent to the actual authoritative name server? Well, it's kind of a race condition. Whoever replies first, his response will be recorded. And since Eve is closely connected or directly connected with his ISP, so his response obviously will come first. In order to launch this attack, there are several obstacles that the attacker has to cross in order to make DNS cache poisoning successful. The first is that the Eve must ensure that the forged response is received by the target DNS server before the actual authoritative name server is given a chance to respond. So I just mentioned this, that since Eve is closer to the local DNS server or ISP DNS server on which he's launching this attack, so the authoritative name server might be located in some other country, in some other city, so that might take some time to get the response. So his response will be quicker, and he will basically win this race condition. So as mentioned here, usually not a problem because the target DNS server must query an external authoritative name server, and Eve's direct response will be received before the external authoritative name server has a chance to perform a lookup. So in that case, he wins the race. The second obstacle that Eve has to cross is that each DNS query that you make, or the request that you make, it has a 16-bit query ID, as I mentioned in my previous video. And the response to that query should have the same query ID. Otherwise, that response will be ignored. So the question now is that the target DNS server normally chooses a query ID when it sends a query to the external authoritative name server, which means when you made the query to the DNS server, the DNS server will make a query to the authoritative name server asking him what is the IP of www.google.com. And this query ID is known only to the DNS server and not known to the attacker. So the question is that when you send a reply back to the authoritative named server, you basically don't know the QD ID. So how would this attack be successful? Because if it doesn't match, the DNS server will simply drop this message. Well, in 2002, it was revealed that major DNS software simply use a sequential number of QD IDs, which means that if the QD ID starts with 1, 2, and so on, so it's basically it goes in a sequence. And then it becomes easy for the attacker to guess what will be the QD ID by sending multiple queries. Now, this is a naive authentication mechanism. Of course, it is naive because it becomes predictable. And you can easily circumvent this kind of authentication based on the QD ID. However, after this QD was disclosed, most of the DNS software vendors, they started implementing randomization of the QD IDs. Means that rather than going for sequential QDs, the DNS servers, they will start using randomized QD ID. So this is the example of what we discussed. Here we have the Eve as the client. He's making a request. Where is www.example.com? This is the DNS server of his ISP. This ISP will send this request to the, the external authoritative name server, asking him where is the example.com. Here the QD ID is X, for instance. While before he replies, the Eve is going to reply back, assuming that we found the QD ID equal to X. So when he replies back first, he is going to make this entry and he's going to drop this second reply that he got from the actual authoritative name server. In this way, there's a malicious IP address that has been entered into the DNS cache, and when the victim wants to visit www.example.com, the server replies him, here is the IP address 1.1.1, and this 1.1.1 actually belongs to the attacker or Eve, the evil. Now, the question is that the randomization of transaction ID, does it really completely prevent this DNS cache poisoning attack? Well, the answer is not completely. The attacker still has the chances of guessing what is the transaction ID by issuing a lot of fake request and response to the same DNS ISP's DNS server. Now, to understand that, what are the chances that he will find the QD ID, the correct QD ID? You have to recall birthday paradox. I'm sure you have studied in some cryptography or basic security course. According to the birthday paradox, which I'm not going to explain in detail, but to give you an idea, the birthday paradox says that if you have a group of 23 people in one room, the possibility that two or more of them have the birthday on the same day, the same birthday, the chances are greater than 50%. So, which brings us to the question that if with 23 people, there are 50% chances that two or more of them will have the same birthday, then what about the QD ID? What are the chances and how many times we have to send the messages to have 50% chances that we get the QD ID? Well, in a 16-bit Q transaction ID, if you issue 213 requests and the responses, there are chances more than 50% that you will be able to guess the correct QD ID. And 213 is nothing. These can be sent very quickly. Okay. All right. Now, okay, in the previous slide, it's just the birthday paradox is just explained that the Eve, the client, he's sending n number of requests and he's sending n number of replies in which he will be successful in guessing the ID. Despite the birthday paradox or the chances that we have 50% chances that the attacker will be able to guess the ID, and the attack is still limited to the narrow time frame. Because in sending these 213 responses to the QD, if in the meantime the ISP receives the reply from the authoritative name server, then he's going to drop all your other responses that you are sending. So the attacker can only try to send responses with guesses for correct QD ID until the ISP DNS receives the valid reply from the ENS. Once he receives the valid reply from the ENS, it will cache it, and the attacker has to now wait until this entry in the cache expires. So depends on the TTL, he will have to wait to launch the attack again. Now, the subdomain cache poisoning attack was discovered in 2008, which uses two new techniques. So in the first technique, the attacker issues many requests that are not meant for this that are not for the same target domain like example.com, but for many non-existent subdomains like aaa.example.com, aab.example.com, aac.example.com, and so on. The authoritative name server for the target domain example.com will just ignore these requests because of the non-existent domain. So let me explain you again. So here in subdomain attack, the attacker, what he's trying to do, he's trying to send the queries for the subdomains of example.com, which doesn't exist. So when these queries, they go to the ISP's DNS server, the ISP's DNS server will make a request to the name server or authoritative name server of example.com. That, okay, tell me the IP address of aaa.example.com. Tell me the IP address of aab.example.com. Tell me the IP address of aac.example.com. So what will happen? The authoritative name server does not have the IP addresses of these subdomains because they don't even exist. So he will just simply ignore them and he will not respond to these non-existent domains. In the meantime, what the attacker will do is he will issue the responses of each of this request along with, guessing the transaction ID. Now the attacker has more time to guess the ID of these non-existent domains query reply because the authoritative name server is not replying back because these domains don't exist. So eventually, the attacker will be able to guess the ID and he will tell the ISP DNS, okay, you didn't get a reply from the authoritative name server. I'm giving you the reply, okay, here is the IP address of these non-existent domains. Now, this attack will be successful, of course, because the ISP's DNS server was waiting for the authoritative name server to tell him the IPs, but the authoritative name server never replied back, right? Instead, the attacker replied back. Now, the question is, if he is successful and the entries are made into the ISP's DNS server, then so what? Because these domains, they don't exist. So none of the victim or the system that the attacker is targeting will visit these non-existent domains. So what's the benefit? Well, the benefit is that the reply for these non-existent subdomain like abcc.example.com is forced to look like a delegation to another authoritative name server. Means that the ISP will think that, okay, the queries that I'm getting for these domains, I think probably it has been delegated to another authoritative name server. So I have another authoritative name server now. So the IP of the authoritative name server will be working like a glue record, right? So here, if you see, you have the reply coming back, abcc.example.com. The example.com, it has a name server ns1.example.com, and ns1.example.com is now mapped to 10.9.9.98, which is obviously controlled by the attacker. So what the ISP's domain DNS server thinks that, okay, this queries, they have been now delegated to another authoritative name server, which is basically the attacker, since the original authoritative name server never replied back. Now, what will happen is that the attacker can now control not just one domain resolution for non-existent, but all the resolutions for the entire target domain, which means that all the requests that will be made to example.com, now these requests will be sent to the attacker. So in conclusion, this attack exploits two weaknesses in the DNS protocol. Number one, relying on a 16-bit number as the only mechanism for authenticity of the DNS response. Number two, allowing a request for a non-existent subdomain to be a non-response, which means that if the authoritative name server doesn't reply, it is considered as a non-response. And then when the attacker replies, his IP address will be considered as the authoritative, delegated authoritative name server. Now, the DNS cache poisoning can also be launched to the client side. So far we have been discussing the attack that was launched to the ISP's DNS server. However, a similar attack can be launched on the client side as well. So what the attacker will do is that the attacker will create a malicious web page which will contain HTML tags that automatically will request additional URLs for non-existent domains. And when the client loads the malicious website, then the reference to those URLs which are non-existent, DNS queries will be made. And then because they don't exist, the actual authoritative name server will not reply. So the attacker will send back the reply to those images or queries for those images or URLs that were embedded within that web page, which will cause the client to cache the poison DNS. So he will again send these glue records to the client, and the client will cache these results into its own local DNS cache entry. And the attacker in this way will be able to insert his IP address into the local DNS cache of the target, and the client will just, this attack is stealthy because the client will feel like the image doesn't exist, or some of the images are missing in the website, but in reality his system basically has made the entry of a fake DNS or server into its local cache, to which all the requests then they will be forwarded. So here is the example of the client DNS cache poisoning attack, where the victim, when he opens the evil website, and then there are some URLs or images that are requesting resolution to non-existent subdomains. This request will be made to the ISP domains name server, which will go to the authoritative name server, but the reply will never come back because these non-existent subdomains, they don't exist. In the meantime, the Eve or the evil, he will send the poison DNS responses to the victim, and the victim will make the entries into its local cache. So the question now is that how do we prevent DNS cache poisoning? Well, at the minimum, always check for the response identifier, whether it matches the query identifier or not. And secondly, use the randomized identifiers for queries, which is usually the implementation. ISPs, DNS servers, which are known as the local DNS or LDNS servers, they should accept the queries only from within their own internal network and not from the external network. Before 2008, that was not a common practice because the servers were accepting queries from external networks as well. However, they changed this practice, and now they accept only from the internal network. However, the cache poisoning is still possible because if the attacker is within the network, then he will still be able to launch poisoning attacks. Along with the randomized identifier, it is also recommended to use source port randomization. So if you randomize the source port, then we know that port address is 16 16-bit in size, so which means that there are typically more than 64,000 source ports. So now the attacker has to guess two things. He has to guess the query ID, which is randomized, and he has to guess the source port if you have implemented randomized source port. So he has to find two things in order to make the poisoning attack successful. However, it does not completely stop the attack So the only way or the only option that we are left with to make sure that the DNS poisoning doesn't work is to use or to implement DNSSEC. Now, I have already mentioned that DNSSEC or DNS security does provide integrity and authentication, but at the same time, the implementation is a bit complex, and most of the organizations, they choose not to implement DNSSEC.